Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-hosts, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and our community organizer and socialist Kenny Cepeda. We're online at what-s-left.webnode.com. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, share your favorite episode, and write down our blog where you found this episode. Thank you. All right, well, let's see. Today we'll be discussing vaccine mandates and the pressure to get the jab, the Delta variant, right, and everything in between. I think this is an episode that is maybe fulfilling to our our space of just being able to share what's been on our minds recently.
Yeah,
because I also been feeling some things around this. I just want to state from the start that we've been getting amazing support from folks, our cult following, as I like to say, and I may not always be in communication with them as much as Andy is, but I do appreciate every person that is listening, or people that find some of these conversations hard, that are still staying in the conversation with us, and that question and are also open to different ideas, and the people who have been sticking around or listened to the entire episode, sometimes these crazy long episodes. I appreciate you being there, being present for these. That's all I just wanted to say from the very start.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we don't have the hugest audience, but I really like the people who are regularly listen and tell us their thoughts, and it definitely keeps me gives me a little bit of hope at a time when there's not much hope to be had.
Okay, let's go ahead.
So,
this is me off. Anyway.
I mean, I think I agree with you, Eduardo, that a lot of these things have been on our minds. But I think what we were going to start with was, Kenny, you know, you've as a person who's a restaurant worker in San Francisco, and San Francisco has been having a lot of both government edicts and also private companies are beginning mandates. You've had some experiences with this, so you were going to probably kick off this discussion with your experience around vaccines and fear, and we'll see where it takes us.
Yeah, I mean, over the last year and a half, or the duration of the pandemic, the mandates affect the industry. The restaurant industry. I work in the restaurant industry, a small mom and pop place. I'm the manager there. And we're a small staff. Some people were let go at the beginning of the pandemic, so we stayed really small. And then when things open up, we had to ramp up. When things go down, we have to ramp down. And so there was also in San Francisco, or the Bay Area, Northern California, we had the fires that also affected our ability to do our job. And so at every twist and turn, we've been stretched not only, mentally, emotionally, but physically as well, because the job has become extra demanding. And so, like these mandates have added a lot of stress. And obviously, from my perspective, it is frustrating because a lot of times they contradict themselves, right? Like you can go to the mall, but a restaurant was not able to open, or like I remember a friend who had a small hair salon, and she posted something along the lines of, oh, COVID doesn't exist in Walmart, in Target, it only exists in small businesses, and in small places, or the ridiculousness of being able to ride a plane, right? Like being separated outside but being packed inside, right? And so a lot of these contradictions, or even like at work, our bosses, saying one thing but contradicting themselves, because they were a lot of people are acting out of anxiety and their logic, aside we're interrogating things from a scientific approach, right? Like asking questions, poking holes, seeing, but blindly following whatever the CDC says. On top of the physical demands, the emotional strain, the frustrations, of trying to make a living in these conditions, you have people suddenly being interested in your medical history, right? Like vaccine, such a casual topic. And, being one person one of the few people where I work not being vaccinated, always hearing, comments, not only customers, but fellow workers, right? Or seeing their doubts around hanging out, even though some of my workers have done crazy shit, and in the whole pandemic, we've been exposed to so many people. There were only 2 people that came down with the virus, and it wasn't severe. And so now we get to now, right? Like, here we go again in a different way, right? Like, there is anxiety ramping up. People had relaxed a bit. Things were open. We were seeing people inside. Also, by the way, risking our lives crossing the street because we're a small place, so we had to cross the street. Never mind, that is a higher probability of dying for me than actually catching the virus, developing the illness, and dying from the illness. And so, but here are all these anxieties. Never mind, the kitchen staff working in hot conditions in the grill, with a mask on, 110 degrees probably for 8 hours, in a day. But the virus is the biggest threat we face, and so here we go again. We, adding tables because, ramping up and then taking them away, and relearning the table numbers, and learning or coming up with new policies for the moment. All these things cause frustration, and it's just, again, we get to now the Delta variant is in everyone's mouth, and so what the hell is the Delta variant anyway? A lot of people and a lot of articles that I read for this episode don't really explain what it is. It just says it's dangerous. It's more contagious, but that's it. It doesn't really go into the particulars, and it says the vaccine may or may, it probably helps. The vaccines, and but yet, I'm starting to see a lot of people that have been vaccinated come down with the virus. Doesn't mean they have the illness, but at least they are reporting to have the virus. Vaccinated people. I've been around a lot of people, in San Francisco, in like gatherings, massive gatherings, where people are outside but without masks. I also went to Lake Tahoe, around people where like maybe 20% of the people are wearing a mask, maybe, and I'm seeing other people getting sick now. So that's what, like where I'm starting to like pay attention. People that are vaccinated, coming with flu-like symptoms or calling out of work, and this is where it goes back to the working conditions of the moment. This is everywhere in the industry in San Francisco for sure. My suspicion is that is, at a greater scale, we have a shortage of workers. When I went to Lake Tahoe, I noticed there were incentives and for hiring people. Even fast food restaurants are offering, $600, $500 bonus for getting hired. I don't know the details of how long until you get it, but the point is that there's a shortage of workers, and these new mandates just add even more stress again, to the point that I feel like I am losing my mind. I am breaking down. I am exhausted in so many ways. I'm irritable. I find so many things ridiculous, and yet, even though I hear some people interrogating, "Oh, I will not get a booster shot," there is no interrogation of the efficacy or even the need or any concerns for any like a dependency on these vaccines, or whether these variants, if they exist as they say they do, are they really coming from the unvaccinated or are they coming from the vaccinated people? Because that is one concern that I think we voice here, that the dependency, right? Like these basically shitty antibodies will give room to other variants, and never mind, right? Like that we have to never mind that we don't interrogate the fact that to live a healthy life, you don't need a fucking vaccine. You need good housing, You need to live a life free of stress, good medical care, good food, the ability to exercise and not work 3 jobs. And so, but again, we are hoping that a vaccine will get us healthy. When and it's just concerning for the future. And now, like, this is the kicker now for me, that 500 bars in San Francisco have banded together. Well, San Francisco and the Bay Area, I believe, banded together to require vaccination proof. Not because the state told them, not because governments told them, but because it's out of their own whatever. So now but they are associating with the state because they are using a state provided registration system, right? The other day I went with my girlfriend to a bar yesterday actually, and we went in and they had I knew some bars are giving you the option to provide proof to be a customer inside, or you could be a customer outside without vaccine. So we said immediately, we want to sit outside. He answered, "Are you vaccinated? Do you have proof of vaccination?" And we said, we're going to sit outside. That wasn't enough, right? Like, this wasn't, he was just curious, are you guys vaccinated? And so again, and then I was listening to Vijay Prashad, and how we were the greatest battle for our generation. The last 20 years was basically Western liberalism versus Islamic extremism. And now I feel like we have a transition into the pro-science vaccinated versus the unscientific brutes. And that's scary, because science has been weaponized. But that's where, like, it's just even more frustrating, because it's not just, doesn't just affect my life at work, but it affects my social life, the way we make community, in different places, which sadly, it's bars sometimes, or just, socializing is getting harder, and it's a starker divide. And people are feeling pressure to the point that I know people that are buying cards to demonstrate that they have a vaccine.
Eduardo, do you want to go from here, or what?
Yeah, I could go. I mean, I think we should share from a personal perspective first.
Yeah.
Because, we're all, like I said from the very beginning, this might be fulfilling in the sense that we have a place, an outlet to be able to share our frustration. We're going to go into some details and maybe some, you, Andy, being with your science backgrounds, whatever that means today.
Yeah, it's true.
We'll go into what Delta variants mean. But I think I have also been feeling very strong. I'm upset that this week I've been asked multiple times about my vaccine status. I've been asked by close friends, and I have also asked them to stop asking me. And whether I took the vaccine or not is none of anyone's business. I think it's a choice, and everyone should have that choice. And it reminds me a lot, I don't know how, this is the connection I was thinking one time. I was in someone's vehicle, and, they know, I'm here on What's Left. They know what I say on Facebook. And it reminds me of, like, someone asking me, are you gay or something, just sorry, but that was the connection I made in the vehicle. I said, I'll share that with you if I feel like it, but are you, I don't know. Why are we discussing? Suddenly it's just, just random. So anyhow, it's been very frustrating. I'm also going on a trip, and there have been changes in whether people will be going into bars or clubs or restaurants, certain places. And here, the Bar Association in San Francisco has recently decided that you have to demonstrate that you've been vaccinated or proof of test, and you have to enter in some places with masks. And it's causing a lot of anxiety for not just me, but also other people, because I know workers that have taken the vaccine under duress. This is what it is. It's under duress. I know workers, Latinos, who part of the reopening of school movement, who are coming to me and saying to me, Maestro, like mi esposo tuvo que tomarse la vacuna, porque my husband had to take the vaccine because otherwise he's going to lose his job, and we have kids. I mean, one thing is I'm being so, what do you call it? Stubborn, necio. And another thing is like being able to like, how do I then comfort a family member who is just like, I tell them, do your own research and, make it's about your choice, but they don't feel it's their choice, right? Because they're under duress, they're under this pressure. And so it's not fair that people are just randomly asking all kinds of questions about vaccine status. And I know teacher friends, the United Educators of San Francisco had recently come out saying that they support the idea of vaccines, but they also recommend testing. And suddenly I saw on Twitter, they changed it a little bit. They tweaked it just a little bit, right? Before I got on. And people are praising it like, okay, there's positivity. I see all kinds of on Facebook, different groups of, because I'm part of these groups because of families in San Francisco that are trying to keep up with what's going on in schools. And I mean, I'm sure they don't want me to be their fan, and I'm not really their fan either, the UESF people, but at least they didn't say they want complete for now. I don't know how long this is going to last for, but they didn't say what San Jose Unified School District said, which is they are mandating vaccines for all workers. And I have teacher friends, I'm never going to out them, but I have teacher friends who are very fearful in San Francisco, and they're hanging by a thread, and they're just hoping that UESF will not give them over to the state and have them be vaccinated, So it's a very tricky situation, and we are, after the 18th of June, when Newsom declared the digital COVID-19 vaccine record portal, this is the future of vaccine passports, the QR codes and all of that. That's going to happen. It's going to happen sooner or later. And the last thing I'll say, this country is so pathetic. We should be seeing what France is doing. I have friends telling me, the left and the right, the conspiracists, for the third week in a row, they have been out on the streets. Thousands and thousands have taken to the streets around France to protest the government's health pass law, which was passed by the parliament recently and still needs, I think it's not like enacted, it just needs some green light. But what I'm reading and also what I'm talking with friends is just that, but I'll just say what's admirable is that it's people on the left and right, the yellow vest movement, and maybe we might have to revisit that because it's just amazing how they are coming together. I mean, everyone is unified mostly around this, and I mean, like I said, vaccine conspiracists as well as vaccinated people. I mean, they're just together, and families are really angry over, the dictation of who can and who cannot go to school, and if the ones who are going to be vaccinated. Last thing, and then I'll turn it over. A lot of us, like myself, I'm not declaring my status yet, but a lot of us, I don't know if I have actually on what's left. I don't care. But what I really want to say is I'm, very afraid because I don't think people talk about how fears of COVID are legitimate, but I have fears over the vaccines. And those are suddenly not legitimate. Those are suddenly dismissed. People like myself who are fearful of the vaccine, we're not just being stubborn because it's a political position. It's really fear. I am fearful, and that's not being validated at all anytime I mention it. And I have 3 family members right now, 3 of which have got the vaccine and 3 of which are experiencing adverse effects. And one of them is in the hospital right now on a ventilator. And these people have had the vaccine. And Andy knows one of them. So so this is like a direct experience. I'm not just like reading something online and, which by the way, we've also continued to invite people if anyone wants to talk about, because these people don't want to go on record, which is fine. But if anyone wants to talk about their adverse effects after the vaccine, they're more than welcome to come. We haven't been reading the letter for people to come onto what's left, but they're more than welcome to come. So I'll stop there. And it's a mouthful.
Yeah, I think it's good that we should start with some of the personal stuff before we get into the details of like what's going on and what's true and what's false about the narrative of the Delta variant, of the danger. I do think there's a danger, but I think the Delta variant is the least of our dangers. And I personally am much more afraid of the effect of either the mRNA gene therapy things from Moderna or Pfizer, or the J&J one, the Johnson & Johnson one, which doesn't use mRNA, but uses double-stranded DNA and has a human adenovirus shell to it. Both of them would force, if they worked, both of them would put an entirely foreign protein called the spike protein and cause my cells to express that protein on their surface. And that's if it works. It turns out the spike protein, at least in the Pfizer and Moderna's, as we're finding, is actually getting into the bloodstream as well. But that's a second issue. So I don't want that in my body. That's my reason. I am unvaccinated, and I don't want to get vaccinated. And like you said, Eduardo, UESF currently has said, and based on an MOU, memorandum of understanding agreement that we reached last year, that you must make that choice available to the workers. But it didn't say to mandate it. But I think our own union is already taking language like, at this time, without the emergency use authorization, or under emergency use authorization, won't be mandated, but it's opening the door for when we are going to see that this, like the Pfizer one, is going to be FDA approved, despite all these adverse effects, despite all the VAERS data around it, despite the fact that other vaccines, which with far fewer deaths associated with it, were taken off the shelf the minute that happened. Pfizer is going to get FDA approval, and then I'm concerned my union is going to blink and force, or at least try to say, if I want to work in a school, that I have to be vaccinated, which I won't do. And I do think we should oppose it for political reasons. But my individual position is mostly out of fear of either short-term effects, possibly, but more of the ones that worry me. This is so experimental. This is so out of the norm of anything that's been done. People are literally having experiments done on their bodies by having completely foreign proteins put onto the surface of cells that never were meant to have that protein. And that's how the thing's supposed to work. That's not if it fails to work. That's if it works properly. And I don't want to be part of that experiment. So I'm going to do everything I can to not get vaccinated, and that would mean I would leave my job if I had to. I'd fight it, but I don't know if I'd be successful. But I love teaching at San Francisco, but I won't teach under those conditions. So that is very stressful for me, but that's the reality. As it is, I'll be forced to do regular testing, PCR testing. And at first I thought it was just going to be people like me, unvaxxed, with masks. And now that they've had to admit that essentially the vaccine doesn't do anything to protect you from what they're calling the Delta variant, I don't think it does much to protect you from any of this stuff. But at the very least, they're saying this Delta variant doesn't protect. Now they're basically saying people who are vaccinated can have as much viral load as people who are unvaccinated, and can transmit this thing just as much as unvaccinated people. And so now they're saying everyone has to mask up. Now the masks don't do anything, but now unvaccinated teachers are masking, students are masking. That's what's going to happen in the school year, which I think is going to be really unpleasant. And by and large, I suspect, the district is saying that we have to reveal our status. Like, you must reveal to them whether you are vaccinated or unvaccinated, which I personally believe is a break of people's medical privacy. But that is also, again, this is part of the conditioning that's coming, is like, we are being trained to give up any sense that we have privacy or autonomy and any sense of control of our body. That's a piece of, I think, what is really taking place here. There's other things I think that are going on, but that's just a piece of it. So, and it's chip by chip, brick by brick, they're breaking this thing down. That I'm really irked at having to do that, but I'm going to report that. And in light of the fact that, as you know, Eduardo and Kenny, that my administration is not necessarily happy with my past practices, and and even my colleagues are not happy with my position around reopening schools or vaccines or masks or PCR testing. I do think I'm going to have a target on my back, or on my chest even during school. So I'm going to have to watch myself and dot my I's and cross my T's, because I don't think it'll just be administration. I think it'll be my colleagues, my fellow coworkers, who are going to think, oh, well, he's dangerous, so we're going to watch him. And if he's doing something that we don't agree with, we're going to report that. That's what I think is going to happen. I think that's the environment I'll be stepping into, because we are in an environment that is like it's a snitch world right now. It's a McCarthy-like world of, and unvaccinated people are being talked about like terrorists, like bioterrorists, essentially. And so-called medical misinformation is being talked about like a hate crime. And so this is the world the left has embraced. It's not fighting it. The left in this country, country is embracing this kind of world, and saying it's the right thing. Whereas at least, and this is what Eduardo was saying, millions of people in Europe see through this, and the parts of the left see through it. People on the right see through it, and it's shameful that we don't have a response yet, and we will need to make a response, or else the Chinese ruling class and the U.S. ruling class, I think, are leading this, and unless we workers in China or workers in the United States stand up against it, the ruling classes in Europe will have to follow, and they will have to break their own working class. So we have a job to do here. So. And we're not doing it.
I should give credit as well that they're in Australia, which is they're having the most draconian zero COVID policies, right? They're even deploying the army, and protesters are being brutally attacked there. I was reading that they are manhandling women and children and removing elderly off the streets, and only 15.5% of the population have been double jabbed, which is why they're reacting in this way, hysterically. But we should look at Sweden that didn't impose lockdowns, and they're suffering fewer COVID deaths than I would presume. I don't know. I won't say about USA and Sweden, but I know for sure I read that it was than Australia, and they've achieved, some scientists are saying, herd immunity. So, I mean, it's wonderful that that's happening over there. It's just disappointing and pathetic that it's not happening here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's one pushback. There's a restaurant owner in Los Angeles that is saying requirement to enter unvaccinated people. You have to prove that you're unvaccinated or something like that. I read.
This is the deli in Albany.
I don't know where here in the Bay Area.
Yeah, it's up here and up north of me. There's, I think, in Alameda almost, or maybe close to Berkeley, up right above it. There's a deli where the guy was basically saying only unvaccinated people can. Now I don't agree with that, but at least I get it.
It's like that. So
yeah.
Pushback. Anyhow,
for me, the scary part is not even the state anymore. It's like, well, obviously the narrative is being driven, right, by all the mechanisms of propaganda that we know, that that galvanized support after 9/11, galvanized support, to go to war in Vietnam, and blah blah blah. You can go, and see all these patterns, of how this is created. But the scary part is this, and it almost like makes me feel, because we're all indoctrinated with narratives of the Nazis, never associating the U.S. doing the same shit as the Nazis, and actually embracing Nazi ideology, bringing scientists here to conduct those horrible experiments, and exporting them, torture techniques all over the world, again, we are indoctrinated with being afraid of Nazis, and wondering how the fuck do people, follow and are able to believe in something against their will, in falling behind, falling in line. And here we are, the left, The left is leading this charge. In San Francisco, we're the most compliant city there is around this shit. And it's not the city pushing it on them. It's people, businesses, like business owners, people themselves policing each other, like you said, snitching and all this stuff. It's scary because, again, this is just the beginning. Like I think of this as, again, the new enemy, right? Like the enemy that we need to go to war. We are fighting an invisible, very mobile thing, and that can come from anywhere, especially China and India, right? Those dirty places, and that's another thing that bothers me, how people don't interrogate the racism that's behind this shit too. And just like our war in Iraq, just like the biggest threat that the US ever faced. And here we are again repeating the same story. We're building, building up a surveillance apparatus, a socially, and it's even more insidious because it's more personal, more intimate, and our enemy is your neighbor, is the person that didn't get vaccinated, your coworker, so it does remind me more of the Red Scare, like McCarthyism, like you said, how people were turned against each other, and that is the antithesis of community for me.
Well, I would say that the issue of this being like Nazi Germany is not an exaggeration. And the area where we know it is taking place was it Kenny or was it Eduardo, you, who spoke about knowing people who were put under duress, who felt the duress of having to get vaccinated? That was Eduardo. Okay.
Well, but people too. I know a lot of people in the medical field.
Yeah. Well, there is something called the Nuremberg Codes. As many people know, the Nuremberg Codes came out of the Nuremberg trials, which were basically trials of the actions of Germany, Nazi Germany, I think Italy as well. I don't know if it included Japan, but at least I know it, Germany and I believe Italy. And people know that there was experimentation done on people in Germany, right? And the idea, part of the Nuremberg Codes that came out was to say, you cannot force people. If there's an experimental treatment that you want to do, which is what Germany was basically using Jews and the disabled and other groups to basically be guinea pigs on experiments that they wanted to do. It wasn't out of cruelty, although it was insanely cruel. It was out of science. Like, why we want to learn something. What would be the effect of these drugs on so and such a group of people? And they forced them to do it or put them under duress to do it. And the Nuremberg Codes are explicit in saying it is commensurate with fascism to force people to take something that's experimental. And that is what our government is doing right now. They are breaking the Nuremberg Code, and they know it. All right, and we even have laws that supposedly say, well, I mean, they do say it, that say it's illegal to allow employees to be forced to take an experiment, something that's experimental use, and it's happening right now. And you'll notice that no actor in the state is trying to say, oh well, we got this law, we can't do that. That's because these laws don't matter, because the state will do what it needs to do, because there is they are calling it like a war, and the terrorists here are the unvaccinated. They are the traitors to the war on COVID, or what they're calling the war on COVID, which is really a war on workers. And as all wars are for capitalists, capitalists never are making war on the thing they're doing. They're always making war on the working class. And this is, again, what's happening here. So I just want to spell it out that these are not exaggerations. This is actually what's happening, and we're only at the beginning, because I do think the prison that's being constructed is being put together not by the state but by the people who are going to be in the prison.
It makes me think of institutions, liberal institutions like the ACLU, right? Where the hell are they on this?
Yeah.
They're fully committed to let this shit happen. They're not about protecting civil liberties, like their names say. They're a lot. The liberal institutions are actually the ones pushing this harder.
Yeah.
In the binary that is constructed in the public narrative, the right wing is fighting this more than the left. But we know, like, we were prepared and conditioned through 4 years of the worst, right, maniac there is. Even though Biden is already surpassing Trump in terms of like his the blood in his hands, especially abroad. We were conditioned into believing that the right wing are ignorant and brutes and they don't know anything. And they're fascists. They're the fascist ones. But look at us now. I mean, having to go to a bar, entering a bar and being asked about your medical history.
And this is an interesting back and forth here, because I think we're exploring something here, which is now the state and tyranny. But go ahead, Andy. I have my thoughts on an article I wanted to read a paragraph on. So it's not about.
Well,
go ahead.
I was likely to probably just transition, because I think the way they're getting this to be done is not just through ideology of distorted facts, but through a culture of fear that they are creating. Like, they are terrifying people. And like, I think they're treating the population like a torture victim, keeping them confused, but keeping them constantly afraid and constantly on edge. And the Delta variant is a part of that strategy.
And they're using scientific language, right? And to give it credibility, create that fear, steer that fear.
What you both are sharing brought to me this article that I read, which I don't want to read the entire thing, but I do want to share it with you all, because Biden said he said a remark. He said, he said that social media giants are killing people by hosting misinformation. This was recent. This was on the 19th of July. And there is a collusion happening right now, and a real collusion. And it's not any collusion gate. It's a real collusion between censored tech and the Biden administration. All right. So this is just from the Associated Press, which is Biden killing remark was called for big tech to act. Right. This is like almost encouraging big tech. And I'm not going to actually read that right now. What I wanted to share was this article I came across. This was a very strong, good opinion piece. And I wanted to share because we were talking about something around this, and it says this is from Newsweek, and it's an opinion piece by Ben Weingarten. Mm-hmm. And this is, I'm not going to read the entire thing, like I said right here. As America witnesses with shock the Biden administration's open and unabashed coalition with big tech to censor those engaging in COVID speech, it deems problematic the administration's allies promising the same with respect to SMS carriers, which are our phones. And Andy, you brought that up at some point. And they threatened to door-to-door vaccination campaign. We were talking about, well, I'm not so sure if I'm very keen on comparing it to Nazi. That's not my opinion necessarily. But we were talking about persecution, and we're talking about also McCarthyism. That's what Kenny had said. So, and there's a threatened door-to-door vaccination campaign. C.S. Lewis saw that a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive comes to mind. Again, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. That reminds me, if people want to see iRobot, when the 3 laws and the robot said, that humans have what? Humans are their own destruction. And that's why that robot, I forget what her name was, if people saw the film iRobot, and there's even a book based on it. The robot was trying to oppress and trying to cause curfews on the people because they were their own, right? They were trying to exercise for the good of its victims. Mm-hmm. And the issue at play here is manifestly not coronavirus vaccine efficacy, vaccination rates, or public policy messaging, but the deeper question of who gets to determine the content of speech and the contours of our public discourse, a free, sovereign people or an insular ruling class. It's not about whether a ministry of truth that lies and obscures all the time can be a competent arbiter of the quality of information, but whether there should be a ministry of truth at all. And so it's a good article, but it's talking, because we're talking about McCarthyism, persecution. We're talking about so I was thinking about the freedom of speech. Free peoples begin their descent to unfree them when they permit their leaders to grab powers in violation of their natural rights on grounds of public health and national security. Typically, this process begins with seemingly minor interventions in the most seemingly unobjectionable areas so as to generate the least resistance. But just as 15 days to slow the spread, I don't know if I'm going to include that right now. We're not talking about that. But I mean, it talks about how we are set up and conditioned slowly by the ruling class in the guise, right? The guise of making sure that they are trying to protect us. And we're being like, there's just no way. They're censoring us. And there's a collusion between big tech and the Biden administration. And here's what I will say. I'm not too sure. I have some conflicts, and I've thought about, I mean, I've heard it before about the Nazi comparison. I have some issues around it, but I have also thought, well, that's the beginning, right? The stages. But the thing is, for me, it's understanding that these things don't happen like that. They don't happen they happen over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't want to live in a totalitarian government. I don't want to live under an authoritarian government. And I don't want to have my freedom suppressed under some guys. Look at what happened with 9/11. We don't have to go so far. So I guess what I'm really afraid of is all this combating of coronavirus misinformation is actually what we need to be really looking at, because it's under the pretext of, oh, we're trying to save lives, no? And I don't think that's hard for people to land. I know, especially amongst my friends, they're just, everything is about COVID, COVID, COVID. And that's like, I'm not saying COVID does not exist. What I'm saying is there has to be wariness. And that's what I'm really afraid of, because under national security, there's going to be a lot of changes in our society.
Well, you mentioned in that article, or they mentioned in that article, teams going into people's houses. And Biden White House was talking about deploying what they're calling Delta variant response teams across U.S. communities with low vaccination rates. So they're actually labeling it even more specifically, Delta variant response teams. And it isn't just a collusion of the Biden administration or the ruling class with big tech. It's collusion with the CDC, with the FDA, with all the institutions across the board. This is a ruling class, a capitalist class plot, really. And I understand the reasons to not. The U.S. doesn't require fascism right now. Because I think the working class isn't organized well enough to require a fascist movement. But what we are seeing is I believe we are seeing the true face of the capitalist class in power. And without all the things where they hide behind certain elements of democracy that are never true. I think we have lived our entire lives, I claim, under an authoritarian form of rule. We just have never seen it that way, and we've been able to see other things that look nice a little bit in shiny objects that they would put in front of us to tell us that, oh, you get to vote and change things, when it turns out that you can't change anything with a vote. I mean, I'm not getting into that discussion necessarily, Eduardo. I'm just saying there's really is nothing you can change. They just give you that, and now they give you that impression, and now more and more things are being stripped away. They're just taking away. They're just moving away the dressing to the velvet glove and revealing the mailed fist behind, the metal fist underneath. And I think that's what we're seeing, is that really is the true state of capitalism and the capitalist class in power, and we're seeing it now. Who would like to start about what you've heard about the Delta variant? I think everyone knows we've been made to be frightened of it. So what have people heard, and what have they come to conclude about the Delta variant?
Eduardo?
Yeah, let's go to Eduardo. Eduardo, then Kenny.
Well, I'll just say one, that it's more transmissible.
Yeah.
I've heard that it's more infectious, that it developed in India, right?
Yeah.
So it comes from this, like, that. Is India more populous than China?
I don't know.
But it comes from India, and it's particularly interesting because India had hundreds of millions of people going on strike, last year, and there was no massive outbreak of this until like months down the line, supposedly. I don't know what's on the ground, really, what's happening in India. I don't. But there's claims that it's ravaging the Indian population, and it's now making it to the rest of the world, right? Like it's appearing in places. Like it's not even like a massive outbreak yet, right? But that's the fear of it. That there is like cases, isolated cases. At least that's what I understand.
Yeah, I've heard that there is a situation where they're finding that the majority of cases that are now being found in some places, like say Massachusetts, I think was a recent one, are now being described as the Delta variant cases, as opposed to previous variants that were Alpha and Beta. I don't know if the other one was called Gamma, but I know there's Alpha, Beta, and Delta. Let me see what the other one was called. Hold on.
Lambda or something like that.
Oh no, it's Gamma. There's okay. So we've had Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and then now we have Delta. We have Delta Plus. There's talk of a Lambda one, and then there's talk of an Epsilon variant. And the other thing I would, I mean, again, it depends who you read, but it is more infectious. It appears to be, at least that's the way it's described. It's not just infectious, it's whether it's also virulent. That is, what percentage of people would die from it if they got it. And there isn't really much evidence, or there's mixed evidence as to whether or not it's more virulent than the initial SARS-CoV, the initial variant or whatever it was of COVID. So there is belief that it's more contagious, but not necessarily that it's more virulent in terms of the infection fatality rate. So that part might be the same or even less. Although there are studies that are done that are used to see how well the thing binds to an ACE receptor and things like that, to suggest that maybe it does more damage if it binds better. If the particular Delta variant of the spike protein binds better with the ACE, there's a suggestion that then might be more virulent, but that is not proof. That's just a binding experiment. So there have been things done like that. And the other things these are things that I know, which is, just as many. It affects unvaccinated and vaccinated. It can be spread by unvaccinated people or vaccinated, and can infect both groups. And in fact, in a British study, showed that vaccinated people were 6 times more likely to die from the Delta variant than unvaccinated people. And that was done by a public health study in England.
The articles I read and in the conversations, the sense is that, or the narrative is that it's the spread of this new variant is due to the unvaccinated. Like the unvaccinated are the reason why this is multiplying and threatening our lives again.
I don't have anything I want to add to. I guess the only thing I'll say to Kenny's point is, that's what exactly one of my friends is telling me, that telling me, don't declare your status to anybody, because there's a lot of hate, there's a lot of madness, and there's a lot of upsetness and culpability towards the unvaccinated, because they're the ones who are keeping this going. When I keep trying to say COVID's here to stay. It's not going anywhere.
I'll start here, actually, with this thing about Barack Obama planning a 60th birthday party, and 475 confirmed guests and 200 people planning it. And they said, well, you can be vaccinated if you want. There's no talk of masking or anything like this. So this gives me a clue as to how worried the ruling class is about this Delta variant, despite all the fear that they are spreading about it. Because clearly Barack Obama, who is older, would be closer into that age category that you might need to worry about this thing. He knows enough not to worry. And the same was true of when all these Silicon Valley people met down in Sun Valley. They weren't masked. They were this was back in June or something like this. They were all meeting with nothing, so the capitalist class doesn't act like, when they're doing their own thing, they don't act like they're worried about some Delta variant or Epsilon variant. That's important to understand, and it's part of the evidence for why there is, not that we should, but why what we need to be worried about is not the Delta variant, but people like Barack Obama or this ruling class. So that's one thing. But the thing I'd say here is this is actually an article from 2018 of a study done that said leaky vaccines can produce stronger versions of viruses. Now, what's a leaky vaccine? A leaky vaccine is a vaccine which does produce antibodies and does a little bit to the virus, but doesn't stop transmission. Because that's a bad one. Because basically, what that does is when you treat people with a bunch of vaccines that don't stop transmission and don't stop infection, then what you really allow for it to happen is that the viruses are essentially, you're creating a selection process for viruses to mutate, which they do all the time, and to figure out how to survive in the environment that they are, this new environment where the vaccine is present. And then they survive, and then they move to another host, which is why they're more dangerous. And this is actually if you might have heard, there was a scientist in Belgium, Dr. Bitchute, who basically asserts that vaccines are like antibiotics in that when they are both overused and imperfect, they allow germs to mutate, or in this case, viruses to mutate in dangerous ways. With antibiotic use, the bacteria that have developed a mutation or acquire a gene that give them protection from the antibiotic will escape death and soon become the dominant strain. That's antibiotic resistance. Bitchute claims that the same thing will happen with coronavirus because he says the vaccines are imperfect and they will allow the virus to keep being transmitted from person to person and thus mutate inside of us until a dangerous new variant emerges. And that's what we're seeing. The current ones are not that dangerous, but he suspects the later ones may become more dangerous. And this isn't just something, like I said, this is not unknown stuff. This is normal stuff. In fact, this study that I'm citing here was done with chickens. And this dude, there were chickens who have had to go through multiple rounds of viral treatments because the viruses didn't fully stop and were somewhat leaky. So they had to create a second virus to deal with a second vaccine to deal with the next stage of virus. And this guy did an experiment of basically he had 100 chickens that were unvaccinated and 100 chickens that were vaccinated. And he saw when he challenged them with various levels of virulent viruses that the more virulent viruses emerged out of the vaccinated group than the unvaccinated group, the ones that were most damaging. And so this was a study done back in 2018. So this is nothing new. And so I think there's all sorts of evidence to suggest. And in fact, if you look at where the host countries are, where the variants emerged, India, UK, and California and New York, these are all places where they started with the vaccine studies. And you can actually tie some of the times where the variants began to emerge where these vaccines were being studied. So, and South Africa is another place. So all of these places seem to be places where the vaccine was first introduced, maybe not launched, but at least started in study form. So I think what we're seeing here, and I think there's scientists who believe that this is what's happening, is we are seeing a set of variants that are being produced because we have a mass vaccination campaign for a vaccine that does not affect transmission or infection, but again, only deals with symptoms, and that it's being done on a mass scale. So it's basically creating all sorts of conditions to find where a host of variants can emerge from different people and then move from person to person, whether that person, it's probably coming out of the vaccinated people, going to unvaccinated people, and then going back to new vaccinated people because there's very little protection provided from infection by the vaccine. The only thing that it affected were symptoms. At least that's what the studies that Moderna and Pfizer and J&J did. So that's my opening bid for some of the science of this. So maybe I'll stop there and see if people either have questions or comments.
I don't have any. I just want to the questions rather. I have a comment to say to our people listening through the audio, that one of your your citations is actually fact-checked from a mainstream source, I suppose. So I saw not to dismiss other sources, but I'm simply saying for those that love that kind of stuff now, and I used to be one of those people. So I'm pointing it out for people.
Yeah, so I'll read this is actually from that article on Leaky. It says, the less than perfect vaccines create a leaky barrier against the virus. Vaccinated individuals may get sick, but have less severe symptoms, but the virus survives long enough to transmit to others, which allows it to survive and spread through a population. And this is a quote: our research demonstrates that the use of leaky vaccines can promote the evolution of nastier, hot viral strains that put, in this case, there is a saying, unvaccinated individuals at greater risk. But in our case, it's going to put vaccinated people at risk. Because, and Kenny, this was what was interesting for me to hear about people reporting sick at work. And Eduardo, this gets back to the people we know in common who've been vaccinated, but themselves are starting to develop colds now. This gets down to the problem of antibody-dependent enhancement. Let me stop sharing for a second. Antibody-dependent enhancement, which is we saw this with all forms of coronavirus vaccines produced back in the 80s, back in the 90s, when SARS-1 came out. They were unsuccessful at creating a SARS-1 vaccine or MERS vaccine, because when they would inject animals with these vaccines they were trying to make, and the animals would develop antibodies which suggested they were mounting an immune response. But it turned out when you reinjected when you reintroduced a virus, the same virus or coronavirus, to those animals, they got super sick, and some of them just died. That's called antibody-dependent enhancement, and that's something that some vaccines do, and you only find that out over time. And that's why the FDA approving this thing in 7 months, when it's usually take at least 7 years, is criminal. Because they're not even giving it enough time to see the ADE effects, which I actually believe I think there's enough evidence now to suggest that ADE is a real thing that people have to worry about. And Eduardo, we know some people who are getting sick and getting colds from vaccines. I don't know if Kenny, if you're finding that your colleagues are more likely are getting more, and that's what's going to happen. They're going to get more sick as a result of being vaccinated. That's what ADE means. It creates a cytokine storm inside of you and creates a massive inflammation response when you have coronavirus that you would not have gotten. You wouldn't have had that response if you weren't vaccinated. All right. Now, the question is well, why don't people who've been infected with COVID and had the actual COVID, why are those people not having an ADE response? That's because they're mounting not just an antibody response, but a T cell response, which means there's a whole array of antigens that they're able to respond to. So their immunity is much more robust. So those people don't have ADE. So if you've had COVID, the last thing you want to do is put a vaccine in you, because that's basically making you subject to a kind of response that might have you have an ADE response, instead of relying on your own natural immunity that will come from having COVID the first time. And by the way, I'll say something else. In the article that talks about this leakiness, they say there's 2 things that you need to do in order to reduce the leakiness. Number 1 is make sure that the vaccine you're using actually stops transmission. If it doesn't, that's a problem. And number 2, pick an antigen, a target that is a broad array of different targets. Don't pick a single target. Well, guess what we've just done here with these vaccines? We've picked, first of all, these vaccines, all of them, the Pfizer, the Moderna, the J&J, the Sinovac, the Sputnik, all these vaccines, they have one target, and that's the spike protein. So that's something you don't want to do. You don't want to create a very thin antigen. That antigen is the thing you're trying to create antibodies to. You want to create a broad spectrum. That's what your body does. Your body creates a broad spectrum of antibody response. Now, if you were going to do this, you weren't going to worry about ADE, the way you would do it is you would isolate the virus, you would break up the virus and make it inactive, but you'd take the entire virus and introduce that into somebody. You'd still get the ADE possibly, But at the very least, you'd create a broad spectrum of antibody responses. Those are how historically vaccines were made. Now, here's where it gets controversial. I think the reason they haven't done that with the virus is they haven't isolated the virus. And you've heard this before. They've never really isolated the actual physical virus. Or there's no evidence that they've been able to do that.
Is that
This
a
isn't
hard
it.
process?
Sorry.
Is isolating the virus a hard process to do?
Well, I don't know what is difficult. It's one of the ways. It's one of the categories for saying, oh, we know that this thing is a virus. You actually have to isolate the physical virus. But to date, I've heard that no paper has produced any evidence that they've been able to isolate the virus. And this is why there's people out there who go, we don't think this virus exists. And I get it.
Right. And I should say, though, that you are making an assertion, right? It's not like you have checked if that's there. You're saying there's no paper produced. Is that what you're saying?
If somebody
You
can
have
find me a
seen-
paper, I don't think it's been I don't think it exists. And I'm just going to say, if somebody can find that paper, I've looked. I've never seen a paper that showed isolation of the SARS-CoV-2 virus.
What paper from like a scientific journal? Are you saying?
Anywhere, yeah, from anything.
Like independent studies, that was like a question that I have, of, like how research is done, right? And in order to have independent studies.
Yeah. Now, just let me be clear. You could call something a virus and not find the virus, but use other pieces of evidence. But not having that one is one of the reasons why people have some doubts.
I see. Now, if people wanted to, they can share it with Dr. Andrew Lipson.
Yes,
here.
please send me the article about where the virus was isolated, and who's done that. I don't think you'll find it.
Yeah.
And for me, like another thing we didn't mention here regarding what we've heard about the Delta variant is that they've had a focus on the younger population. That it affects the younger population. And, to me, that seems like a convenient way to push vaccination of the younger people. And even though we know, right, we've talked about their own evidence shows that kids, don't get nearly as affected by the virus. And so here we are, potentially, right, like creating the, what is it, the enhancement dependent, what is it? So can you?
Antibody dependent enhancement.
Antibody dependent enhancement on kids, right, that have to live a long life and develop an immune system, and by being exposed to other kids too, right, be socializing. That's how we develop things, by being exposed to to nature and things like that, like too, right? Because that's one thing that's also evidence to me, that I grew up in a foreign country where like we were more exposed to things. It wasn't as sanitary in any Western sense of the word. And so I am around people here that are so allergic to many things because they were protected, right? And so, like it worries me, right? Like these young kids are gonna develop antibody dependent enhancement, at such a young age. And so what does that vote for the future of, again, the community and like the things that people are worried about right now, right? The things, and so it's interesting how that doesn't get into consideration, and it's almost automatic. Like we're just waiting for, people to authorize the vaccine, for the vaccine to be authorized to be used on younger kids, even though we don't really understand, other than what the CDC says, beyond that.
I mean, friends in the UK are telling me that in some clinics in the UK, they're even giving vaccines to 16 and 17-year-olds without parental consent.
Yeah,
I don't know here in the USA if that's happening. I know.
Yeah, it is, because you don't need to have there are federal guidelines that don't insist that the parents that parents give consent. You should try, but if they don't give consent, if the kid wants it, go ahead and give them the shot.
And right now we're at 12 and above, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I would say that if it's true that this virus is more contagious, it is possible that you're going to see cases starting to emerge among younger people. But again, cases and the ability for it to do damage are two different things. So if it's as virulent or not, like if it's not as virulent, then it's actually going to have less of a chance of doing damage to those kids than the one in the past. But I would say that it is possible and very likely, actually, and it's particularly true if people are being. I personally think, this is my opinion, I think the vaccinated people are going to be more susceptible to bad effects from these variants because of ADE.
You know, one of the stories I've heard in the industry, you know, the restaurant industry, through management and other people, is that the shock, right, that vaccinated people are developing, are infected with COVID. You know, but obviously, from my point of view, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of you, but like having the virus doesn't mean you have the illness. That's my understanding.
Correct.
And so, just having the virus is a shock to people, right? Especially vaccinated people. And even before this, even before the vaccine was even a thing, you know, like just we were with that idea that just having the virus was a death sentence. You know, and it took my family to get infected. Bunch of my family in Guatemala have gotten infected. People with highly immunocompromised systems have had the virus, and one version of it, if it's true that there's variants, because they have had different symptoms, and so they've had the illness, you know, and they're fine, you know, by and large. And the other thing is, like, you know, one thing that I thought about is through my brother's experience of being infected with the virus. He actually developed the illness, and is that, you know, we automatically assume that, and that's the narrative, that the virus itself makes you, you know, like leaves aftermath, right? Like you're tired and this and that. But my brother was 28 days laying on the bed, doing nothing, just bored out of his mind, affecting his mental state. And of course, if you're 20 days, 8 days without doing anything, if you go on a hike afterwards, you are going to be out of shape, massively out of shape. You know, and that's something else that we don't consider into these things, right? Like we just associate everything with the virus because it's so in our mind. And
Eduardo, you want to say something? Because I have something to say about that.
Go ahead. No.
Well, and also remember that there have been doctors who are getting censured and who are actually being threatened with losing their licenses, who's saying, we don't have to be treating COVID symptoms. Because you are right, Kenny. There's a few problems here. Just because you get identified as having SARS-CoV-2 in you, that does not mean you have COVID. Doesn't mean you have the symptoms of COVID. But if you do begin to develop symptoms of COVID, there are doctors out there who are using ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, zinc, vitamin D, vitamin B1, vitamin C, various steroids, a steroid that I can't pronounce, that are using these to develop a treatment to deal with the symptoms. And people are having great responses because they say, basically, you know, all I have to do is keep people out of the hospital, and that's what they're doing. And so, if I don't know if your brother had that kind of treatment, and that's what should be happening here, because particularly if you have a vaccine which supposedly only affects symptoms, don't vaccinate. Take these drugs which have already been used broadly and for a much longer time and have much more known side effects and very much reduced side effects. That's what you do. But again, and this is another problem, in order for the drug companies that are producing these vaccines to get emergency use authorization, they had to show that there was no other treatment available that people could use. So that's why these doctors who are using this have to be shut down, because it's one of the legal avenues that Pfizer and Moderna and J&J have used to say, oh, give us emergency use authorization, because there's no other possible treatment for this thing other than a ventilator, which is going to kill you.
Just this is what you're saying right now, Lipson, these drugs, these you know, other treatments, right? This is where the fact that we are so blinded from what's going on outside the world. We really don't know. Most people don't know what's going on in France. Most people don't know what's going on in Australia, other than the fascists, the alternative, right? Like, we're not doing that. We're doing the passports. But also, you know, I have a different vantage point. All those treatments that you mentioned, Lipson, they were given to my family in Guatemala. They were given a package with, zinc, all this vitamin C, all this aspirin, blah, blah, blah. They were given a package, and they were fine. None of my family had been hospitalized. Not to say that there are cases, right? Of course, there are exceptional cases to anything, but we use the exceptional as the norm. And again, we are blinded that this has happened in Mexico and in Guatemala. That's how doctors are treating this. But here, like you said, exactly, my brother went through that shit here, and I have other friends that have gone through this in the early beginnings of this. They didn't give him shit. They just put him in a room. Be in a room, be scared. One of my friends had COVID, and she wasn't. The symptoms that she felt were more from anxiety than the actual, illness.
Yeah.
I guess what I want to add is just to your comment. Well, expand more on your comment about doctors being censored. I don't see how we are going to be able to. It's just so hard. I was talking about earlier that article that I was reading that I shared my screen with, and here's what I wasn't very comfortable comparing what's going on to Nazism. I was more comfortable comparing it to McCarthyism. Mm-hmm. But here's what I will say that is a bit more radical, that I feel, not more radical than Nazism. Like, I feel more comfortable saying this, what I'm going to say. I think the Biden administration will be one of the worst administrations, worse than the Trump administration, given in what direction we are going. And that's very, it's out of character for me to say that. But it's because of what you said, Andy, it's what you're saying. And what I want to add to is, it's doctors not being able to speak out. It's this censored tech and journalists. And I found another article when I was doing some research before the episode, and there are journalists that are now coming together because they're feeling that COVID news has been censored to create one official narrative. And I found it. This one is here where it says, journalists claim alternative COVID news. And this is from the Press Gazette. And almost, I'll just read very little, but it's almost 30 journalists have banded together to object to censorship and fear-mongering about COVID-19 that they say has been put out by the media and tech giants since the pandemic began. The group, who have called themselves Holding the Line, Journalists Against COVID Censorship, have argued that the attempts to share concerns counter to the one official narrative or one scientific, in quotes, truth, have led to reporters being criticized by their managers, freelancers being blacklisted, and the public receiving a distorted view of the truth. Unprecedented reporting. Elijah, who came up with the group's name and found it therapeutic to talk to others with the same concerns, told Press Gazette, it's been unprecedented the way COVID-19 has been reported in the UK. But not just in the UK, worldwide. There's only been one official narrative played out in the mainstream media, and that has not changed over time. There's only been one scientific truth allowed to be discussed. The one endorsed by the worldwide governmental regulatory bodies, even that has been very selective. This has given the public a distorted view. And which is sort of repeating, but that was more his quotes of what was said earlier in the first paragraph. But what is wrong with debate? What is wrong with, I used to think, if people look back at What's Left episodes, that there was a need to sort of quell or constrain or restrict certain voices because there could be, like my fear at that time was Alex Jones, and people can look at those episodes and as I had shared in the COVID journey of mine in the other episode 2 weeks ago, it's this that I'm beginning to see, that even journalists and doctors that are that are with fear because of reprisals in newsrooms, in clinics, in hospitals, and coverage is very hard these days. I have to write down all the websites we are sharing with each other, and I have to have it on a document so that I can click on the link of the website and go to it, because I can't find it in any of the searches on web browsers. You have to save this information. So it's challenging, and I don't know how else I mean, that's why I do think that Biden administration is going to be in history one of the worst right? But I can definitely start feeling that this is, this is 2021. What will the next 3 years look like? And this is from this is my last one here. I'll just read. This is from a listener, which she wants to maintain herself anonymous. And she emailed me, and she's my friend, and she listens to What's Left. And she said, one of the biggest takeaways to me is, what if the science is wrong? All of these pro-vaxxers blindly trust the science, but science is never settled. And these scientists sure don't have a good track record. And she lists a bunch of things. And she goes on to say, so they expect us to sacrifice ourselves for the common good, in quotes. But if all lemmings are running over the cliff to their deaths, then I'll just wait and see till the, quote, settled science changes. We only have time, ... to wait and see, ... I'm just trying to prepare myself mentally because all the vax people have been pathogenically primed. In the animal studies, all of the animals died when they came across the virus later on. But most people won't listen, or it's too late for them. So personally, I'm just trying to psychologically prepare for the dark winter. And the dark winter is the reference to Bill Gates. So that's from one of our listeners who listens to us, the three of us, and the What's Left in general. And so I thought I'd share from one of our listeners, because I think I'd like to also give him a voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what she's talking about is the pathogenic priming is another term for ADE. And she's talking about the experiments that were done there. And the irony here is that if we hadn't run this through Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Pfizer, CDC, WHO, if we hadn't let those people run the show, but had basically allowed people to get COVID, people are going to get COVID, but treat them in the way that the doctors who had the treatments in Guatemala and Mexico had done, and they already knew about it there, then what that would have meant is, though, as people would get COVID, and then you'd have, instead of this antibody response that comes from the vaccine, you'd have the T cell antibodies, because you did get COVID, you did mount a full natural immune response to the thing, you got sick and suffered, because again, let's remember, only 20% of the people who actually got the infection even got sick. But if you were in that 20%, you were able to be treated with these things that Kenny was talking about, or some of the American frontline doctors are talking about, the hydroxychloroquine or the ivermectin, then you would have a T cell immune response that's a broad antibody response to future. Then you don't have variants. So then you have what's called herd immunity, and you don't have to vaccinate a single person. But again, now what has Fauci done? Fauci said, well, we used to think that herd immunity was going to be at 70% vaccination. He was talking about for a vaccine that doesn't affect transmission or infection, which itself is a lie. Now he's saying, well, with this Delta variant, now we've got to go 80 or 90%. And this is basically, the Delta variant is being used as a fear weapon to drive everyone into vaccination, because that is what's going to put us into this situation where they can do QR codes, whether you go into a bar for your job. And this puts us into the big data analytics situation where everyone gets to collect our data. We're on a digital dashboard around our health information and our employment information and our schooling information. And essentially all our information is open to the people who want it, which is Silicon Valley, the US government. And they're using it to build their AI. They're using it to control us, to surveil us, and to influence us. And we are being put into this giant data mill, but at the risk of our own health, and it's wrong.
No, it's just, yeah, it's wrong. It's scary, and because again, it's we've become the agents of executing those plans. If we have been infected, but it's not a virus that goes into your, attacks your immune system. It's a virus in our minds, and most people, it's just in our minds now. And even people, like, even I, like, I'm not gonna lie, like, I who, listen to this, try to listen to alternative things, come up with my own things. Even I've been infected with that. I have my doubts. Like, what if I'm completely wrong? What if, that is more chest pain, or like, like, we still have questions about it. And, I see the way people look at me when I hang out with them, and, like, how they, like, kind of, like, pretend to put their mask on, like, or like, like, there is just questions. And so this already lives in our mind, just like terrorism did. And so now this is more personal. It's more like one-on-one, because your neighbor, your loved one, Eduardo, you mentioned earlier, like, some people are not having sex. The people you interact with are you potentially your death sentence. That's the narrative we've been fed into our mind. And again, an idea is the biggest virus that, that could be spread.
Yeah, I don't want to go in depth about too much. I'll just share my screen and have people look at that just quickly. It's an article they can find in The Guardian, which is affecting us socially. We talked about how the pandemic was affecting people, and people were having socially, it was affecting people. And people can look up this article here if they wish. It's The Critic, and no sex please, you're unvaccinated. And it's an interesting article. I thought it was more humorous than anything, but it's serious stuff because it is happening. But people's loneliness, people's relationship status, everybody, you can't be on the app these days unless you claim, have you been vaccinated? A lot of apps are requiring you to state your status, which is difficult. So the pressure's on. And speaking of pressure, there's this Offspring is one of these
punk band.
Yes, thank you. And Pete Parada, who has been declared, unsafe to be around it, and now, is being told that you can't participate anymore in the band. It's like affecting musicians, people's sex lives, right? I mean, the pressure is so strong, and people can read this. This was in The Guardian. I was looking up some interesting things.
And Offspring is like, I like their music. It's like fight the power, don't buy the bullshit kind of thing. And look at these guys now.
Yep.
Except for the drummer, who's like, trying to, like, stand up for himself.
And he says, since I'm unable to comply with what is increasingly becoming an industry mandate, it has recently been decided that I am unsafe to be around in the studio and on tour. You won't be seeing me at these upcoming shows. I also want to share my story so that anyone else experiencing the agony and isolation of getting left behind right now knows they're not entirely alone. It's, kind of sad. People have to feel like their livelihoods, their passions, everything. It's permeating everywhere. I mean, that's the real virus.
Can I show a video that I think is interesting?
Sure.
And we'll see if we want to include this. So this is this woman, Leanna Wen, who's doing an interview on CNN about the Delta variant and the pressure that they want to put the unvaccinated under, because she kind of speaks for the Biden administration.
On what it is that we do at this point. So now we have this Delta variant that is much more contagious. Because it's more contagious, it's going to be even harder for us to reach herd immunity. We're going to have to vaccinate an even higher proportion of people to get there. What happens then if we end up having another variant developing that's even more contagious, that could cause more disease, that could evade the protection of our immune system? And so how quickly we get this under control and which way we go depends on what we do now when it comes to vaccination, to overcoming disinformation. And what we really need to do at this point is to make vaccination the easy choice. It needs to be hard for people to remain unvaccinated. Right now, it's kind of the opposite. It's fine. I mean, it's easy if you're unvaccinated. You can do everything you want to do anyway. But at some point, these mandates by workplaces, by schools, I think it will be important to say, hey, you can opt out, but if you want to opt out, you have to sign these forms, you have to get twice weekly testing. Basically, we need to make getting vaccinated the easy choice. That is what it's going to take for us to actually end the pandemic.
So that, to me, the way that woman was putting it, couldn't be more clear that they are using this Delta variant as a weapon to force our compliance. And they have identified the unvaccinated as the people who are the target, and they're going to do everything they can to take things away from us. But I think people who are vaccinated should ask themselves, do you think it's going to stop here with just this? You don't think it's going to come at boosters? You don't think it's going to come for some other health thing where they're going to say you have to do this or you're not allowed to go to work? And they've established a precedent by which the government or corporations can say where you go and where you can't go. That's what we mean by a passport. Passports aren't about freedom, dude. I mean, we all know that. For passports are about control. So when they build a passport into a vaccine passport or whatever, they are building a mechanism of control of where you work, of where you go, of where you, anywhere in this country. And that's only a piece of what they're trying to do. But they know why they're trying to do it. They know why they're telling these lies. It's just a shame, because I actually think these lies are fairly transparent. Like, you even saw her there. She mentioned contagious. She didn't talk about it being more dangerous. She just said it could spread more. And she wasn't going to tell you anything about the fact that it's the actual vaccination itself which seems to be spreading the variants. She's not going to say that. I actually think she knows that, because that study that was done before was 2018. But they're going to tell any lie they can to a public that has made itself used to listening to follow the science leaders of Biden or Trump or whatever. They're going to use any lie they can to get us to do what they want.
Like, I've come to the conclusion that, what's happening has less to do with public health and more to do with immigration. Because that's about mobility. That's about, who's worthy, who's not, deciding, who's legal, right? Like, who has the authority, who's authorized to do something. So, yeah, and the sad part is that we, on the left, and even like in community groups, like, we are the agents again of that, and in the name of protecting the weak, the vulnerable, in the name of that, we're creating a system that's gonna even jeopardize the safety of the people we care about even more, if we're not fighting these systems of compliance and social control.
And I think Eduardo has mentioned in a few of his articles, I don't know if it's all of them, has mentioned Silicon Valley. And it's not just about censorship for Silicon Valley, and that's not the only role, is that this also is about data. And it's about big data analytics. It's about getting people into a system where their data can be harvested and collected, and they can use that to, again, know what people are doing, to build better AI systems that they need to compete with other companies and other countries for, and also to use that AI to control and manipulate us, and to make it not happen like what's happening in France and Italy, like where people are resisting. They want to stop that, and they've got much bigger things in store for us in terms of stripping wealth from us and stripping rights from us. They have much bigger things in store. So they have to figure out ways of being able to do that with a much stronger mechanism of control. And the vaccine passport is their passport to getting in on that.
I guess I'll say one last thing, which is, this is becoming a long episode, and that's definitely not going to be part of YouTube. But I wanted to point out that there's so much talk about also for schools that they want to mandate for children to have, right?
Mm-hmm.
The vaccine. I see it on so many Facebook groups in SF Unified. And yet, just a day ago, the BBC, which is a mainstream news source here, they've just come out with a report that long-lasting COVID-19 symptoms are rare in children. And not only that, children who become ill with coronavirus rarely experience long-term symptoms, with most recovering in less than a week, the research suggests.
Mm-hmm.
And headaches and tiredness were most common symptoms. They weren't severe. And this is compared to adults. Children are far less at risk. So And there was one other here that was said. Dr. Liz Whitaker, an infectious disease lead at the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, she said, this study is reassuring for the majority of children and young people who develop SARS-CoV-2 infection and reflects what pediatricians are seeing in clinical practice. Why then are we having discussions about vaccinating children? And, you know, I was just thinking as we were talking, and I was hearing you, Kenny, and I was hearing you, Andy, you know, it's interesting. We make up a very interesting crew here because, Kenny, you've shared your experience in the service industry. Andy, your background in science and how that you look constantly at what's going on there. I'm the son of a construction worker and an educator. And, you know, I think what I just want to be left with is that we should be doing, we repeated it several times here on this episode, but we should be doing what they're doing in France. And it's an important time right now. The left and the right and the unions here for sure are radical. The union here in San Francisco, I'm sorry, is very pathetic. But here, the union declares a strikes. Look, this is an article. If people are seeing my shared screen here, the union declared strikes against unconstitutional vaccination mandates. And this is left and right forces in France, you know. And I have never seen us, the San Francisco, at least not in my lifetime. I don't know if maybe I'm wrong, Andy. You've been in the union longer, UESF, but nope. I don't know many unions that have declared strikes, and definitely not against these mandates, you know. And we're workers, the three of us. I just mentioned our backgrounds. This is what we should be doing instead. This is what we need to be doing as workers, united. You know, it's about our choice. It's about what we want, and it's, you know, it's going to be a mixed bag, like we're seeing in France. So that's all I wanted to point out. Maybe that's where that's it, final for my statements, because I do feel inspired by what's going on there, but I do want to see it here. So,
and this is why we need to launch California Workers and Students for Choice.
Oh my God, are you saying?
Yeah. I think we should do it. Michael Caine, if you're listening, contact Eduardo. He's ready to do this.
Oh, Jesus. Con Kenny.
And Kenny.
I'm down. We gotta do something. It has to become action, and like it's one thing to just keep talking about it, and you know, but like at the moment they're, you know, picking us, you know, like apart, isolated, you know, and again, like you said, Eduardo, like the pressure is like making a lot of people getting, you know, the vaccine, even medical workers that I know that have hesitancy, right? Like, we've heard of that word a lot. And, you know, until recently, I think that the hesitancy is pretty high among like medical workers. And yet a lot of people that I know in this area, because of the pressure and just about everyone here, at least, you know, the dominant narrative is that everyone has it. You know, and so the people choose to either shut up or just pretend that they have it, you know, because the pressure is so high here, because we are the most compliant group of patsies in San Francisco, you know, and it's funny that we're so arrogant to call the right-wingers, you know, patsies, and, you know, but here we are doing the bidding of the state. We're so arrogant to criticize them for fighting the wars while being afraid of the state, and here we are, you know, and again, like in just talking about it, it's not gonna do shit. We're gonna have to do, you know, what I call power moves, you know, and claim autonomy over our lives, our bodies, our future. And, you know, this is not detached from the struggle that we have to engage in, right? To see a better future and create the society we want. But, you know, and I invite comrades, I invite everyone who, you know, who is weary of the state to revisit our recent history, revisit how they got us to accept all the shit they did with the Patriot Act, you know, and all those, the surveillance state that they built. You know, that was a precursor to this. You know, that was the warm up to this. Like right now we're in the threshold of something massive. You know, I also invite people to go see, you know, what the Fourth Industrial Revolution is about, because they literally tell you there. And you're gonna see a lot of familiar shit. You know, they're not shy about it, but they wrap it in the clothing of, you know, social justice, equity, you know, community.
Protecting the environment.
So go check that out. it's scary, and it's moving at a very fast, and we think it's just science fiction. But I was learning about DARPA. DARPA, they themselves say, DARPA is where science fiction becomes reality. That's kind of their motto. And so I invite people to, analyze all these things and what's happening, and to really test whether what you think, really makes sense, in the bigger picture and in your life. Does it make sense? What you're hearing, what you're preaching, what you're talking about.
I have nothing more to say. Thank you.
I agree with Kenny. We have to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have some ideas.
Yeah.
And I think if people like this idea, this group, reach out to us, because hopefully we will get started on it. If we don't get started on it soon, I guarantee you I'll do this after my wedding. But I can't start it till after the wedding. But I'm hoping that my comrades here will be willing to get started on this sooner, so we can get a bit of a jump start.
No. All right. Well, we'll talk more details afterwards. But yes, I think there should be something that should be brewing. Maybe not served yet, but at least brewing.
We have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
So I think the time is now.
Yes, I agree. Right, everyone ready?
Yes.
Right. Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast that's challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, or on our blog. Please write this down, because this episode is not going up. I know it already. I was hearing keywords from both of you. what-s-left.webnode.com. That's our blog. Again, what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you have heard here, please share your favorite episode, rate, review, turn on your notifications, subscribe to any of our platforms on podcast, which doesn't seem like they're censoring us right now, on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play. We're on Bitchute, LBRY, LBRY, Odysee, ODYSEE, YouTube, sort of, and on Telegram. And if you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog, just like my friend did and emailed me. And we can read something out loud on the episode. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-hosts Kenny Cepeda and Andy Lipson.
And if you like the idea of California workers and students for choice, let us know in the comments, and hopefully we can get you started on that.
Yeah. All right. See you all later. Thank you. Ciao.